John Chowning here for Dialogue on Public Issues with Campbellsville University. Welcome back once again. Appreciate our loyal viewers out in the community and area. And today we're discussing a very important topic in our culture today, and one that provokes a great deal of emotion on both sides of the issue. That is the topic of the death penalty, capital punishment. And today my guest is a young lady by the name of Hannah Cox with an organization called Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty. Hannah, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm the national manager for Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty. I have been a policy advocate and working in the political realm for several years now, and I kind of stumbled into this work. So I was first getting involved in the policy arena with something called the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and was asked to work on the death penalty issue several years ago. And had initially been very pro-death penalty, and so refused at first, and after being prodded a bit, agreed to start doing some research and look into it a bit more heavily, and was quite surprised at what I found, and was really shocked and convicted over some things. And so I slowly began working on some death penalty issues, and now I am leading one of the largest repeal organizations in the country. So we work to educate conservatives about the issues that we see with the death penalty, and try to point out that these principles really do align with conservatism.
Your background is very much in the conservative movement. You're not a late convert to the conservative movement.
I am not. So my first role in the government I was in the music industry for several years, and wanted to get out of it, was looking at going to law school, and decided to try my hand at a couple things first and make sure I liked it. And so my first role was with something called the Tennessee Firearms Association. So I was working on a Second Amendment group. And after that, I went on to work for the Beacon Center of Tennessee, which is a free market think tank working on constitutional economic issues in Tennessee, and then came to this role about 6 months ago.
And I don't want to put labels on you, but from conversation and your presentations while here, and from our prior contacts with each other, you're probably a libertarian. Is that a fair
I think that's
summary of your ideology?
It's fair to say, I think. I grew up, my dad's a Southern Baptist minister, grew up in a very Republican household, and I think up until about 2012, I sort of was just, Republican in name. I hadn't done my due diligence and really figured out exactly what I believed. After starting to work at the Tennessee Firearms Association, someone gave me a copy of The Law by Bastiat, and that was really a fundamental book for me that opened my eyes to what became my principles and my economic theories, and I dug really deep into the Austrian School of Economics, and so I found myself leaning more towards libertarianism, sort of in the middle of libertarian and conservative. I have very conservative personal values, and I think that those all align with the work that I'm doing now.
How would you define, and I don't want to get off onto the libertarian movement, but just for our audience who may not be that familiar with libertarianism, and who may, when they think of libertarian, they may think of the Libertarian Party convention, and see people of all kinds of really interesting and fascinating people from it really is one of my, every 4 years in presidential years, one of the highlights of that cycle is watching the Libertarian Convention.
It's just highly entertaining.
Exactly. It's just so fascinating.
Yeah.
You said middle of the road. Middle of the spectrum.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Often when you say libertarian, people think big L Libertarian Party. I think in reality, a lot of people that you probably assume are more conservative are really just the libertarians in the Republican Party that are sort of, and I think there's a lot of similarity between libertarians and true conservatism, who are really living out those principles. So if you look at a Rand Paul, or you look at a Thomas Massey here in Kentucky, those are people with libertarian beliefs in the Republican Party, and I think that you can kind of use libertarian or conservative interchangeably. But they're people who truly believe that government should be limited, that the government that we have should be effective, that it should use our resources wisely, that it should be managed effectively, and they also, I think, are people who, at the root of their beliefs, know that government is not a solution. Government cannot come in and fix problems for you. Government cannot be God. Government cannot force people to act morally. What government can do is protect people's rights, ensure that they have protection of their person and property, and that's really the best we can hope for. And so I think there are people that really live out those things. Too often in both parties we see people that are trying to take the government much further, and I think what ends up happening is that ends up with a government that starts interfering in your rights or those of your neighbors. And I don't think that those are conservative values, and I don't think they're Christian values either.
It's always dangerous to label people and to stereotype liberals and conservatives and to have these predetermined stereotypes. But one of those is that conservatives are law and order. And to be law and order, you believe in capital punishment. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I think that's one of my favorite questions because I used to be law and order. When I was thinking about going to law school, I was thinking about being a prosecutor. When I was first asked to look at the death penalty, I was very pro-death penalty. What I knew of the actual system at that time, though, was so limited. I think most of my knowledge came from like Law and Order SVU. So, you know, I came with this perception that everyone in the system acted ethically, that you always had DNA evidence laying around everywhere, that was always infallible, and that you got the right person. And when I started getting involved with the system, what I found was that what I thought our system was structured as was nothing of the sort. So I thought our system was based on the principle by the English jurist William Blackstone that said it's better that 100 guilty men go free than one innocent person perish. I really thought our justice system was set up to work that way. I think most people believe our justice system is set up to work that way. When I started digging in and found out the amount of innocence issues and the amount of corruption issues and really started seeing things behind the curtain, that's when I became very concerned. And what I also realized around that same time was that what we were doing was spending a lot of money in this country, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars a year. I think in Kentucky, your justice system is about $600 million a year. I know in Tennessee, where I live, it's close to $1 billion a year. We still have very high violent crime rates, especially in the South. We have a lot of violence occurring, and we also are leading the world in incarceration. So we're locking up a lot of people, we're spending a lot of money, and it's not working. We're not actually being tough on crime. What we're doing is being tough on the criminal. And I think that's our problem, is we have a very punitive system that waits and waits and waits to respond until a serious tragedy occurs. And then it comes in with a very punitive measure. That doesn't actually deter crime. We know that most people do not think about the sentence when they're committing a crime. That does not actually in any way focus on restoring a person or helping them get back to being productive members of society again. And I think that ultimately what it does is have something where people come out, they recommit, they go back, they come out, they recommit, they go back. And we have an ongoing crime problem in this country. What I propose, and I think that my organization proposes, is actually a reimagining of our justice system to one that is focused on catching people who have been traumatized, who have signs that they might become violent early on, addressing those problems early on, and actually trying to prevent more crime from happening. That's tough on crime. I think that's a better approach.
Most conservatives are pro-life.
Definitely.
Certainly pro-life up to birth. The preborn child. We don't call them fetuses.
Right.
Or we speak that the preborn child is a human life and hold that very dearly. But yet, after the child is born, our pro-life position sort of goes to the wind in many ways. Let's be honest, we conservative Baptists especially, we're kind of guilty of that. I can say that because you and I are both conservative pro-life Baptists, I would presume. To the point, what do you say, how should that impact, if I say I'm pro-life, how should that impact potentially my view on capital punishment?
Yeah, our organization actually started in Montana with a group of conservatives and conservative Christians who were really convicted about that and who strongly believed that in saying they were pro-life, that meant not just being pro-birth, but being pro-birth, pro-life throughout the spans of someone's life and even all the way through death. I think at the core of that is the underlying value that all human life matters. All human life has dignity, and I don't think that human dignity can be taken or given. It's inherent as a child of God. You have human value and dignity, and I think that that's something we have to get back to in our movement is really that really overwhelming respect for human life and care for the person. You know, I think as a Christian on top of that, that means that I recognize God loves everyone and that anyone can be saved at any point. I don't think there's any person too far gone that he can't redeem. I think that many people are coming to that recognition as well, that if we're going to be pro-life, we actually have to be pro-life from start to finish. And that's brought many people to our movement.
And I might say, just for the record, for me at least, as a pro-life person, that includes proper nutrition for the mother and the child prior to birth, and it includes poverty and addressing poverty and hunger throughout the life of the individual. It includes economic opportunity for all, etc. The issue of life is a comprehensive from the womb to the tomb, so to speak.
Definitely.
And we Baptists and conservatives and evangelical Christians in particular need, I think, to consider that very deeply and very carefully.
Absolutely.
For our consistency and for the testimony, for our testimony as Christians.
Exactly. If you want
faith.
the world to look at you and see that you're different, you've got to act differently.
Now, what do you say to those that would argue that the conservatives in particular, that the death penalty is soft on crime, or that you're too concerned about the rights of the accused rather than the plight of the victim?
The first thing I would say is that we know the death penalty is not a deterrent.
Okay.
If you look at rates of crime in regions that have done away with the death penalty, you see about a 25% difference in regions that still use the death penalty heavily. That's not only indicative that it's not a deterrent, but I think that means that the resources we're using to address and try to carry out the death penalty in a few select number of cases, that's resources that we're not spending to actually catch more crime. So if you look at our solvency rates in this country, they're pretty low. We have a clearance rate for homicides of less than 60% on average across the country. We have even lower rates of that for other violent crimes. I think that it's not being tough on crime to spend millions and millions of dollars to carry out a death sentence for one person when you're actually allowing the vast majority of crime to go completely unaddressed. What about those victims? What about those victims' families? They're getting absolutely no closure whatsoever. They're not even having the person caught. So to me, to say the death penalty is tough on crime, I couldn't disagree more. I actually think it contributes to more crime and prevents us from actually having a system that makes our community safer.
The amount of expense of maintaining someone on death row versus the cost of lifelong incarceration. Discuss that.
So we know that the death penalty is the most expensive part of the criminal justice system on a per offender basis. Most of the time when you say that to people, they say, kill them faster, you know, get rid of some of these appeals. Well, not only is that problematic because of the numbers of innocents that we found within the system and the likelihood of killing an innocent person, I certainly don't want to forego any appeals or speed up the process at all. But on top of that, it actually wouldn't cut costs. So if you look at the cost studies that have been done, they find that 70% of the death penalty's costs are incurred at the trial level. So that means you're taking those costs on even if you don't get a conviction. And we've seen that of the death penalty cases that are still being brought forth, convictions are down 60% since 2000. So this is money we're spending just to have the death penalty available, not even necessarily carried out. Why
is that case so much more costly than if the prosecutor, or if it's in a state where the death penalty is not even it's not on the table, it's not a part of the process?
So if you have the death penalty on the table and it becomes a part of the negotiation, you immediately go into a process where you are paying more witnesses, you're paying for more lab results. You have a two-part trial. So you have a guilt and innocence phase and you have an innocence phase. That's a much longer process. So that's many more hours that are worked by law enforcement, by prosecutors, usually by public defenders, by judges, by clerks, by all involved in the court process. You have a longer jury selection process. You're having to house that jury for a much longer time period. All of those hours combined to make it so much more expensive. And in the North Carolina cost study, they found that the trial portion is actually 4 times that of the appellate process. When you couple that with the fact that most people who are on death row die of natural causes, they are serving life in prison without parole ultimately. You're spending the same amount to keep them in jail as you are someone with life in prison without parole, plus you have the cost of the trial. All of that combines to make it at least $1 million more expensive than a life without parole.
You have the cost of maintaining that prisoner just like you have the one on life imprisonment, plus the continued appeals process.
Well, the person with life without parole would also be going through an appeals process, but it's really the trial that's adding so much to the front of it.
Process.
So much to the front end of it that it's drastically more expensive.
If I'm on a prospective in a juror pool, and the the prosecutor or defense is questioning me as a potential juror, and they ask me if I am pro or anti-death penalty. Death penalty is a potential penalty. What will happen to me as a juror? Will I be kicked out?
You won't get anywhere near it.
Automatically?
Automatically. You have to agree that you would give the sentence of death if it were.
Is that fair?
I don't think so. I think it ends up with us having juries that are already very prone to giving death sentences that probably are not people who are as familiar with the system, perhaps. I think that as someone with religious views, that's also very limiting and somewhat discriminating. We've seen recently some questions about what might happen to Catholics in the near future, given the Pope's recent update for the Catechism in the Catholic Church. Will they still let Catholics be on juries? I don't think that makes a whole lot of sense in any situation that someone should be limited because of their moral
beliefs. It's somewhat
beliefs.
contradictory, is it not, of the notion that in our system you have a trial by a jury of your peers.
Exactly.
And I realize an accused, I'm sure some prosecutor might argue that person's not a peer to, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But it just doesn't seem that that's equitable.
No.
To just throw out someone that has questions about the death penalty.
Exactly. And you wouldn't even have to necessarily say you were anti-death penalty, but just that you might have questions about it.
A lot of people have questions
exactly
about it, whether you could apply it or not, vote for it or not. And that brings me to my next question. As people of faith, there are a lot of Christians and a lot of churches, including the one I pastor, I'm sure that would say, throw it to them, throw the book at them, and maybe approach it technically from a point of faith from an Old Testament perspective, more so than from a New Testament perspective. In the context of our faith, how does the New Testament enter into this? And this is a theological question more so than a legal question. But we're having we can't have this discussion as people of faith without our faith informing.
Absolutely.
And having an informed discussion from a position of faith. How does that change that notion of an eye for an eye concept of the Old Testament justice system?
Right. I certainly think it's something we have to consider, and to me it changes everything. I think Jesus ushered in a new era, a new covenant, and I think that when you start looking at the Bible on this issue, there are people who can make a case for it using the Old Testament, and there's ample evidence to make a case against it in the New Testament. Where I fall down on that is I know in the New Testament it says that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. In James it says that God sees all sin as equal, and in Romans it says that the punishment of all sin is death. So what does that mean? We've all sinned, all sin's equal, and all of us would die, all of us would get a death sentence, but were it for Jesus' blood shed in our behalf. And so to me, it would be very hard for me to say you deserve the death penalty for this crime or for this sin, because I think Jesus' blood can cover that sin as well as any sin that I've committed.
And Jesus himself was falsely accused.
Exactly.
And underwent the most hideous capital punishment known to the Roman Empire.
Exactly.
Moving along, the impact of improved science on DNA. What has been the impact of that?
I love talking about DNA because it contributes to so much of the system. First and foremost, it contributes to a lot of wrongful convictions because people trust DNA inherently. The problem with DNA evidence is it is only available in less than 15% of cases. On top of that, it's often not pure DNA. It's not the same thing as if they were to take your blood right now or a cheek swab from me where it's 100% concisely your DNA. They're often dealing with something that has multiple types of DNA on it.
You mean they couldn't just necessarily take my cup here and,
and
prove that I did or didn't do something?
Exactly. You can have touch DNA. You can have all kinds of contamination of DNA. And we know that many types of things that were considered DNA evidence have been debunked, like microscopic hair analysis has been totally thrown out the window, and many other types of things that were once considered foolproof. So DNA is not only not that present, it's not infallible. There's oftentimes been many other issues within the lab and how they're processing evidence and chains of command issues such as that. So I think it's a really dangerous thing that people trust DNA at the levels that they do. And that was something that was surprising to me when I got in the system too. I thought DNA was everywhere.
Oh, absolutely.
And it wasn't until I started working around some attorneys that said, it's not really like that. That's not how this works.
Our television would have us believe that.
Right. You just think that everything's forensic, and it's simply just not the case. So DNA evidence can contribute to a lot of problems, but it also can be helpful. And we've seen that there's been, I think, 60 or so post-conviction DNA exonerations in this country so far. Of those, 20 have come from death row. Now, we've had 164 exonerations from death row across the board, but 20 of those DNA evidence was used to prove that they didn't do it. So it can be a great tool, but it's one that I also always want to clarify can also be weaponized against people.
Well, I was going to say, are you suggesting that perhaps some have been falsely, by junk science, have been falsely
yes.
penalized and found guilty with junk science?
We know that of the almost 3,000 wrongful convictions we've had in this country, that 45% of those involved misapplication of forensic science. So it has been involved in a lot of wrongful convictions.
Is there compelling evidence that the death penalty is applied, excuse me, disproportionately to people of color?
Yes. So there's two ways I like to look at this. First, you can look at who gets the death penalty. When you look at that, you do see almost equal numbers of black people on death row as white people. When you consider that black people are 13% of the population, I think that's evidence that you obviously have a lot more black people who get the death penalty than white people do in proportion to the amount of the population they make up. On top of that, if you look at people who have killed interracially, so white people who have killed black people, only 20 of those have gotten the death penalty. You look at black people who've killed white people, it's been 290 of our executions. So I think there's definite evidence on that end, but I think there's even more evidence if you start looking at the race of victim that there's racial bias in our system. In some studies in Louisiana, they saw that you were 96% times more likely to get the death penalty if you killed a white person than if you killed a black person. In California, which is seen, as a very liberal state, you're 3 times more likely to get the death penalty if you kill a white person than a black person. That has held true in every study that they've basically done across the country. In 96% of cases that they've studied, there's been evidence of race against the defendant or race against the victim bias, or both. I think that that's something that's been an ongoing problem in our criminal justice system at every level. Back in the early 1970s, when the death penalty was first overturned at the Supreme Court level, there was heavy evidence of racial bias at that point and arbitrariness in sentencing. It was overturned. When it came back in the late 1970s, states put a number of things in place that were supposed to limit this, including aggravating and mitigating factors and limiting the classification of what crimes could qualify for a death penalty trial. But unfortunately, we've seen that has not managed to fix these problems. Several states, due to that evidence, have done away with the death penalty on their own. Most recently, Washington in October, a university there produced a great piece of research that was really digging into their system, and there was just so much evidence of racial bias within it that their state Supreme Court struck down their death penalty system.
Where is the action now, Hannah? Is it in Washington and in the Congress and at the Supreme Court trying to develop laws that the Supreme Court would or cases that would come through the court system to the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, or is it in the state capitals around the country?
It's at the state level.
Okay.
I think that for some time there was definitely strategies that were targeting the Supreme Court, but I really think that our organization believes this is a state-based issue. That's for a number of reasons. I think that produces more long-term impacts. It's much easier to have a Supreme Court overturn a decision than it is to have various states come together and overturn. And so I think that's a better longer-term solution. I also think constitutionally that's the right approach. I think that states should be
in keeping with a libertarian or a conservative value.
Exactly. So we think that's where this should be occurring. We've seen many states taking action on this in recent years. Only 30 states still have the death penalty at this point. Of those, I believe it's 10 have not used their death penalty system in over a decade, Kentucky included. And I think you'll continue to see that trend continue. I know Wyoming has a Republican-led effort to repeal the death penalty this year. Colorado looks like they'll repeal the death penalty this year. New Hampshire actually did repeal it last year with 2 Republican-controlled chambers. It was vetoed by their governor. They fell 2 votes shy of override majority, but given the midterms, looks like they now have override majority to finally get it totally off the books.
What state uses it the most?
Texas.
Okay.
Yeah, the usual suspect. Last year there were 25 executions. It was the 4th year in a row that we had less than 30 in the country. That's drastically down from, say, 1999, where we had hundreds. And of those that carried it out last year, there were only 8 states, and Texas was responsible for over half.
This is a conservative community. Our listening audience is conservative. This is Trump country. What would you say to those watching and listening to convince them to think about what you've presented here. And how can they learn more about your organization?
I think, again, as limited government believers, as people who want government to be small and effective and equitable, this is a system that isn't meeting any of those marks. It's wasting so much of our money. We're not getting any result for it. I think that we should be concerned with crime, and after this long of a time period of experimenting with this policy and so much evidence that it does not work, that we need to start restructuring and looking for solutions that will actually meet the needs of our communities. And I think that if people want to get involved, there are many ways they can do so. They can go to conservativesconcerned.org, which is our website. Okay. We're also on Twitter at CCATDP, our acronym, Facebook as well. And then if people would like to dig more into the research around this, I would encourage them to go to the Death Penalty Information Center, which is actually a totally unbiased just research center. They don't take an opinion on the death penalty. They produce a lot of research around it and have some great studies that people can check out.
Hannah, thank you so much for your time and travel to Campbellsville for 2 days.
Thank you.
And we wish you Godspeed and the very best in your endeavors and the work you're doing across the nation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chowning. I appreciate you having me.
John Chowning for Dialogue on Public Issues with Hannah Cox, National Manager for Conservatives Concerned about the Death Penalty. And we thank our audience for watching and listening today.